My name is Sally Reeves, and on behalf of the Louisiana Landmark Society, I would like to welcome you to the Martha Robinson Lecture. Martha Gilmore Robinson, known for her political activism and preservation advocacy, Martha Robinson was a prominent civic leader in New Orleans for over 50 years. In 1909, she graduated from Newcomb College along with such preservation luminaries as Mary Morrison and Hilda Hammond. She was a founding member of Le Petit Théâtre de Vieux-Carré in 1916. She also served on the case committee for the Child Welfare Association. Eventually, she turned her attention to politics, serving as president of the Women's Division of the Home Election League, and 2 years later, founding the Women's Citizens Union, which was sort of a predecessor of the League of Women Voters with which it merged. In later years, Robinson became interested in historic preservation, co-founding our organization, the Louisiana Landmark Society, in 1950. In the mid-1960s, she served as president for the Louisiana Council of the Vieux-Carré, which is still functioning, as we are. In her lifetime of public service, Martha Robinson received many honors, including the Order of the British Empire, and she sounded like this. She said New Orleans like that. She received the Times-Picayune Loving Cup, and also she explored every possible avenue to lead little people like me at the time and the rest of us who have come of age under her tutelage into preservation adventures. After her death, with generous funding from her family, the Louisiana Landmark Society established its annual Martha Gilmore Robinson Lecture, both to preserve her memory and to explore fundamental and broad-based issues that are related to preserving our shared heritage. So thank you for coming to the 2022 Martha Gilmore Robinson Lecture. This year, board member Nathan Lott is chairing the Martha Robinson Lecture Committee. And I will now ask Nathan Lott to introduce our speaker. Nathan, thank you.
Well, thank you, Sally. It's been a real privilege to do this, and in particular to work with our featured speaker today and to work with his team. So I want to acknowledge that there's a number of people behind the camera today, behind the computer, working the slides, and I hope that you'll thank them, those of you who are here in person at the end of the event, because they're making it possible for us to have a great event here in the room, and also for the many people joining us on Zoom. So I welcome those who are joining on Zoom and would invite you, when you have thoughts or questions, to use the Q&A function or the chat function. And we do have Chris, our tech guru, who's going to be reading your questions at the end for the Q&A. And obviously for those in the room, you can ask some questions in person. So without further ado, I will introduce our very special guest, TeddyPierre, who is not just a master mason with 37 years experience in that field, but he is a graduate of Tulane School of Architecture, and he is essentially a very knowledgeable architectural historian. And he takes that knowledge of building types down to building materials and can tell you one brick from another, where it was made, and how to put back together our historic buildings that suffer from neglect, that suffer from our extreme weather. And he's done that all throughout our city. You probably have looked at his handiwork and not known that. He's also done it in cemeteries around Louisiana, and I hope he'll tell us some about his work, perhaps in the Q&A, in other parishes outside Orleans Parish, where he's helped restore numerous tombs and monuments. In addition, Theodore's history with Louisiana Landmark Society goes back many years. He actually started a program to educate young people about New Orleans architecture pre-Katrina back in 2004, and Louisiana Landmark Society was privileged to help support that program with some financial support at that time. So it's a longstanding relationship, and we're extremely blessed to get to have Teddy speak with us today, because he's going to share a vision, not just about the past, but a vision for the future of a very special place. And he's going to talk to us about monuments, an idea that has been fraught in our own time recently, and help us understand things that have been neglected and overlooked as true monuments to the people of this city, and ways that we can honor them by also engaging young people and really bringing vitality to a part of our city that has been, by many people, overlooked too long. So without any further spoilers, allow me to introduce the Martha Robinson Lecturer for 2021 and 2, since we had to cancel it last year, TeddyPierre Jr. Teddy.
First, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. We had some challenges with the weather and other issues, but here we are. And we're going to talk today about a project that seeks to redo Lafayette Cemetery number 2 by first examining, reimagining it as an educational resource, an educational landscape. I am a brick mason. I was trained as an architect out of Tulane University, and I've been working in preservation in Louisiana for my entire career. I've had a lot of time to think about the big questions in this field, and having come to it from those two different points of view, which kind of give me a unique perspective, and at least I think it does. I think when you work in preservation, there's a sense of urgency, particularly in a climate like Louisiana, Southern Louisiana. With this urgency comes a sense of the impossibility of total preservation. You have to approach it with almost a sense of triage. What structures are most urgent in need of repair, and where do we spend our limited resources to get the biggest bang for our buck, to get the best return for our efforts? So what I'm about to share with you is the results of my thinking on one of these questions, the fundamental questions. What should we keep? It's not a question that we could readily answer. In fact, it may not have an answer. But as I work, though I divide this question into two pieces. What should we keep, and how should we keep it? We talk a lot about the results of preservation, but I find that we don't talk often enough about the actual process of preservation. And that's much of what I'm going to emphasize today, the actual process of preservation. When I worked on the African house in Melrose Plantation, I had a really a sense of honor having been asked to work on that iconic structure. And it was also very important to me that as I was working on it, to begin to understand that not only was I preserving a building, but I was preserving a process, the process of preservation. I had many discussions with organizations like the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, which is happens to be headquartered in Natchitoches, which is 17 miles from Melrose Plantation. And of course, Melrose Plantation was built by and for African Americans. And this building, the African House, is thought to have had an African uh, uh, bent to its design. However, there are many who dispute that, and that's a topic for another lecture on what was the actual design. And it all has to do with the fact that there's a masonry base to the building as opposed to a straw or adobe base to the building. But what I got a chance to do was to bring together a group of young people who had no previous experience, people off the street in Natchitoches, Louisiana. And I was able to share with them what my father had taught me. And in particular, as I was interfacing with them, the process of preservation, history, I was sharing with them the history of the building and giving them everything they could possibly get from that experience. Now, I think a lot about the other side of the coin when I'm working in the cemeteries. One project that I completed was the restoration of this marble column in St. John's Cemetery in Thibodaux, Louisiana. The column had been damaged in Hurricane Katrina by the branch of one of those venerated oak trees that surround the cemetery. And when I encountered the structure, it was in three pieces. The base and the shaft were intact, but the two top pieces had been knocked to the ground and had been on the ground for several years and covered with biomass. My first task was to clean it, which I did with you'll be happy to know, with a D2 solution, not with bleach, of course. You never do that. That is absolute heresy in this profession. So, but then I had a very successful restoration of this column. But as I was working on it, I kept thinking about the fact that there were probably many, many other pieces that were on the ground or perhaps even underground that will never get restored. And how fortunate this Dr. Young, Dr. Thomas Henry Young, and his descendants were to have this very expensive project executed in his name and in his memory. So, nowhere are these questions more tangible than in New Orleans cemeteries, where tombs act like monuments for a family or individual, too many to number, too many densely packed and on top of one another. And I think as you see the tombs, you have to ask, why are some of them standing and some of them falling? You have a sense of being in an archive and watching names slowly being blotted out, some faster than others by decay and by the passage of time. As someone who spends a lot of time working in these spaces, I wonder, who are we forgetting? Or rather, who are we allowing ourselves to forget? I know I'm not the only one asking that question. This very organization, Louisiana Landmark Society, has it written on their website. In the end, our society will be defined not by what we create, but by what we refuse to destroy, end quote. What we need to remember is that preservation is not primarily retrospective. That is, it's not primarily concerned with keeping the past for the past's sake. We are saving answers to questions that have not even been answered yet. Questions like, what was important to you? And why was it that way? And how did you build that? Preservation is actually about looking into the future, not about dwelling on what was. And if you keep our eyes on the future, perhaps we can start to answer that big question, big tough old question, what should we keep? This idea is at the heart of the project that I'm going to introduce to you today, a project centered on Lafayette Cemetery No. 2, which we lovingly refer to as LC2. LC2. LC2 is a city-run cemetery in Central City portion of New Orleans. LC2 was originally established for the city of Lafayette, which in the 1840s, before Lafayette was incorporated into the city of New Orleans. It looks a lot like the other cemeteries in the city, Lafayette #1, Valence Street, St. Louis #1 and #2, except for the way we interact with it. While other cemeteries get tourists trekking through them and tour guides giving all kinds of information about them, LC2 is an outlier in an underserved neighborhood. Now, I spent a portion of my youth in this neighborhood. I didn't grow up in this neighborhood, but my elementary school, Holy Ghost Elementary, which is now defunct, amen, Holy Ghost Elementary. Holy Ghost Elementary is about a block and a half from the cemetery. But there was another element in that neighborhood that really gave it its shape. And that was the garbage incinerator that occupied the lot directly behind LC2. And from time to time, I don't know about you, Warren, but from time to time, that cemetery, that garbage incinerator would belch ashes that would fall on our books, on our papers while we were in class. But today, of course, it has been demolished. It is now a Superfund site because of lead contamination. So it's a memory. It's a distant memory. But that's what helped shape my idea of this neighborhood. Well, it's just a memory. Okay, next. As early as the 1840s, you can see the two main roads which define the cemetery, Accardo and Deconomus, defining the city of the dead. They divide the space into 4 quadrants, with the northwest quadrant designed for the burial of the colored citizens. Yes, it was designed and used as a segregated cemetery. You can watch that crossroads over time, from the 1840s through the first decade of the 21st century, a steady origin to a shifting grid. But as Central City has changed, as the country has changed, as I have changed, this cemetery is a constant, but we cannot rely on its constancy. As I'm getting calls to go to other localities, other cemeteries and other areas, and do restoration work, there's never a call to Lafayette #2. It just sits there. The plants are growing fast in places where they should not grow. Bricks are falling and it needs so much help. Already the Louisiana Landmark Society designated the tomb of Society Française an endangered site in 2020. Conservative estimates are in the millions for the restoration of the tombs that urgently need work. Where on earth would that kind of cash come from? I had this idea. What if we have it backwards? What if instead of asking what this cemetery can do for us, what we could do for the cemetery, what about what this piece of land and what it contains can do for us? So that's the thinking. Now, some of you may know that originally 19th century cemeteries were intended as public amenities. Here I'm showing you a cemetery in Brooklyn called the Greenwood Cemetery, a contemporary of LC2, constructed in 1838. This cemetery was, if you can believe it, one of the primary inspirations for Central Park. Visitors loved the grass, the trees, and the lake so much that they wondered out loud whether it might be better to have it all without those pesky graves. I've no illusion that we can turn LC2 into a park in the typical sense of the word, but it can serve its neighborhood, providing vital functions and enhancing the community in which it's a part of. But what's important here is that the typology was originally conceived of as a public amenity. And not only that, but a collectively owned one. Each plot owned by and tended by a separate family. We have ownership over this space, yes, that can be a major, major pain in terms of renovation and restoration. We're going to encounter that, I know. But it's also an incredible opportunity to practice one of the most modern urban propositions: community-owned public space. No, we may not be in the possession of a soccer field or a lush forest, but we have something even more valuable on our hands. We have a library. We have a classroom. And this was a conscious effort on the part of those who built cemeteries in the 19th century. One cemetery builder said, quote, "Our cemeteries, rightly selected and properly arranged, may preach lessons to which none may refuse to listen and to which all who live may hear," quote unquote. What I'm proposing is that we listen, we start listening, that we look at this space as an irreplaceable educational resource, which is not owned, established, and curated by a higher organization, but by the very same people whose history it preserves. Because of that, Lafayette Cemetery No. 2 holds stories and pasts and secrets that aren't recorded in our textbooks. This brings us back to the idea of preservation as a prospective, forward-looking activity. When we can take our own history in our hands, we can quite literally shape the future. And today I'd like to show you why and how we should preserve Lafayette No. 2. 1 second. Oh, I don't have them. All right, Lafayette No. 2. This is where our project comes. This is where our project comes in. It's called Pierre Palant Project. Pierre Palant means speaking stone in French, because all we need to do is to listen, and these structures will tell us how to save the space. The name is a double meaning. It's also an homage to my father, TeddyPierre Sr., and the charge he left me to do my very best work with the skills he taught me. My father was a very storied masonry craftsman in his day. In fact, he built that parterre garden right outside this door, and I was an apprentice under him at the time when he built it. As I mentioned earlier, the structures in Lafayette No. 2 require significant investment to keep them intact. However, there isn't much funding around for brick and mortar restoration. But we have found that there is quite a bit of funding available for historic research and educational organizations. So this project proposes to act as a transformer, turning available research funding into educational experience, which will include lessons on practical preservation. Eventually, our aim is to restore the physical artifacts in the cemetery by using them as educational assets. Each restoration of each tomb will be made into an educational exercise from top to bottom. Building materials, history, the thinking that goes into it, all of it will be made very plain to young people that we will serve. A year and a half ago, this project was just an idea that I had, marinating for several years. In fact, it was beginning to be very painful, the fact that it had not yet come to fruition. I met a wonderful filmmaking crew, William Sabaran O'Reilly and Antonia Zanaro, his assistant. That's that young lady in the corner back there, who agreed to work with me to create a documentary which described what I was attempting to do. It had a different name, a name that Sally Reeves hated. I called it E3 at LC2, E3, Educational Enrichment Experience at Lafayette Cemetery No. 2. She hated that name. But anyway, so I've grown up. I still like the name. I thought it had a special kind of, scientific kind of sound to it. But anyway, this team this past summer said, no way, we're not doing that. That name ain't working. So this team agreed to work with me on this documentary to describe the mission and also began to portray LC2 in a light that was very unusual because it was sensitive and beautifully depicted. Many of the images you have seen and will see in this presentation are stills from their initial piece. Soon after that, I was introduced to Dr. Susan Hackett, whose academic background allowed us to apply for and be selected for the Monroe Fellowship through New Orleans Center for the Gulf South at Tulane University. This summer, we were joined by a graduate researcher from Cambridge University, oh yes, Charlotte Smith, who helped us continue our research of LC2 and refine our project's mission. Since then, we've officially incorporated as a nonprofit under the name the Pierre Pallon Project, with a board of directors whose ties to the community and the field of preservation are unrivaled. Some of our directors are here today, and some of them have not been able to quite make it, but here they are. Norman Dixon Jr. is the president of the Young Men Olympian Jr. Benevolent Association, whose tombs, they own 2 tombs in LC2, and they are still active today. It's a very interesting organization. Nikita Shavers is the founder and executive director of the De Niro Shavers Educational Fund, which seeks to promote programs within the city of New Orleans that promote youth empowerment and community development. She also works as a coordinator with the Youth Empowerment Project just down the street from our cemetery. And then there's a name which I'm sure most of you in here know, and that's Mercedes Whitecloud. Mercedes has been involved in preservation, and of course, the area that really gets her worked up is the area of lime mortar, and in particular, the lime cycle. She gives these great lectures on the lime cycle. And I mean, really, at the end of it, you're ready to go out and get you some lime and put it to use. So anyway, we've got this great team. Together, we are seeking towards the realization of our collective vision that this cemetery will become a living classroom, open to all and constructed in a constructed resource that gives back to those who maintain it. We'll elaborate on our project strategy and our first steps in this in a bit. But first, we'd like to talk to you a little bit about our first official Pierre Pallon tours of LC2. Today, this is a digital walkthrough, but one day soon, this tour will be offered to groups of kids from Central City and later to students of all ages. That's our approach, is to start first with the folks in the very close proximity. That's a big word with a proximity. Start with them first and then move out into other parts of the community. It's not going to take very long to do. On this tour, I'll try to show you the cemetery as I see it, an irreplaceable collection of vast and varied knowledge, which is how I hope everyone will see it when this project succeeds. This is a diagram we put together with help from Michael Miller, a teacher at Strelly Community School. When we look at LC2, oh yes, I got to point this out. This is my favorite one. Why? Because we say geology. That sounds like such a big fancy word. It is. But in that cemetery, we've got igneous rock, that's granite. We've got marble, which is metamorphic rock, and we've got sedimentary rock. We've got flagstone and slate. There are any number of discussions and involvements and experiments that could be generated from just that one topic. And look at the rest of them. Oh, excuse me, I knocked on the TV. And look at the rest of them over here. Okay, so we already know that there's tangible evidence of New Orleans and Louisiana state history, as well as history on a national level. But we also find, here we go, geography, see if you can find it, geography, material science and chemistry, art and architecture, as well as the history of jazz, the civil rights movement, and even constitutional law, right there. Within this one block, there are hundreds of potential topics waiting to be explored. All we need is the right teachers and circumstances to make this happen. So I'd like you to imagine that we're standing here at the gate on Washington Avenue. This is the front gate of the cemetery. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through the cemetery together, and I'm going to point out as many of these topics to you as time will allow. But while we're standing here, you'll be able to see the examples of several types of burial structures that appear in Lafayette number 2, from copings to society tombs. We'll start with the family tomb, whose architecture immediately raises the question, well, why do they look like that? Why aren't these people buried in the ground? The answer to that question is tells us two crucial things about our city's history. One is geographic, that the water table in parts of our city at times is so high that in-ground burials are very difficult to maintain. But also these burial traditions and some of these building forms are inherited from French and Spanish colonists. They're remnants of a Catholic tradition of above ground tombs, particularly in places like Corsica, where the ground is too rocky to rely on in-ground interments. So they didn't just come from us. They were brought to us in these cases. One is an environmental response, but the other one is cultural. There are other pieces of this colonist legacy visible within the cemetery, helping to underscore the unique cultural mixture that exists here in Louisiana. As we walk through, we will see written French on some of these markers. Since until about 1830, most New Orleanians spoke French as a mother tongue. These tombs and their architectural elements are tangible and unforgettable teaching tools for students learning state history. Now, moving to the left of the entrance, let's talk about how these structures function. Most of you have seen these tombs before, but at Pierre Palant, we're working to supplement what you can see from the outside with diagrams like these. Sections which will let you peer into the inner workings of the buildings. Traditionally, you would place a body in its casket in the tomb on one of the shelves. After a year and a day, the remains would be consolidated by heat and time and will be moved to the caveau, the underground space between the tomb, below the tomb. So for most tombs, you could have 1 or 2 people contained at a time. But during some periods of history, when that rhythm wasn't quite fast enough, so the city built what were called wall vaults, or colloquially ovens. Families rented these spaces, some of the families rented these to keep an extra person within while they waited for space to open up in their family tomb. There used to be a whole row of these along wall vaults right here along Washington Avenue. Now, you might ask, why was the death rate suddenly spiking in New Orleans? Well, like so many American cities on the Eastern Seaboard, was plagued for years with a recurring epidemic. And that, of course, was yellow fever. It took a long time to work out what was causing it, but today we know that it was transmitted by mosquito, whose life cycle would cause surges of the deadly disease. In fact, in this cemetery, we found a tomb that contains an entire family that was killed by yellow fever. This provides a perfect opportunity to discuss vectors. Oh, I like that word. Vectors of disease. A vector. What is a vector? That's the kind of question we like to pose to students and get an answer. What is a vector? Let's find out. The differences between bacteria and virus and other topics suited to early students of biology. Again, with an engaging and tangible hook, our tombs, just by reading the tombs. As much as I'm sure you'd like to continue a discussion of large-scale public health crisis, given the events of the last few years, we should move on to discuss some architecture history. As we move through the cemetery, we will encounter examples of several architectural styles which appear in New Orleans architecture outside the cemetery, from Greek Revival, the Gothic Revival, the French Enlightenment flavored neoclassicism. These simplified buildings provide perfect opportunities to learn architectural terminology, from pediments to plinths, cornices to gabled roofs, to columns and pilasters. We can find examples of entablatures, dentils, lintels, parapets, and various materials and styles, helping shore up a lexicon of design elements that is appropriate even to the modern domestic architecture. Of course, these buildings are not in perfect condition, but we propose to use that to our advantage. One of the wonderful things about decay is that it reveals the underlying structure of a building. I often look at these tombs in disrepair, and I can actually see an architectural section in 1-to-1 scale. From this vantage point, we can start to learn not only about design, but about building construction and material science. We can start by discussing brick and mortar construction, the structural system of most of these tombs in the cemetery. I'll take you around the corner to see this tomb, my favorite tomb in the cemetery, whose masonry is exposed. When building for longevity, bricks were preferred by the early New Orleanians and because Louisiana is poor in natural stone. These bricks were held together by lime mortar. There goes Mercedes, think Mercedes, covered with lime-based plaster. But because of the condition of the disrepair here, we can actually see behind the plaster coating to the underlying brick. Now, if you look closely, you will see a redder brick, a soft red, that is what we call it, on the upper course, and then on the bottom, a hard tan. Bricks are made from fired clay, and the origin and material quality of that clay determines the durability and attributes of the brick. Soft reds, which are also referred to as low-fired brick, produced from the clay of the Mississippi River, are softer and less durable than the bricks, the hard tans, which were produced from the clay surrounding the northern part of Lake Pontchartrain. Builders in the 19th century used hard tans at the bottom frequently of a structure because while they were a little bit more expensive than the soft reds, because they had to import them from the North Shore, they kept out moisture more efficiently and were more durable than the soft reds, while reserving the soft reds for the upper courses. Meanwhile, the mortar that was used to hold these elements together is truly ancient, lime mortar. Lime mortar is the same material that was used to create some of the longest lasting structures in the world. Before the introduction of Portland cement, which happened in 1824, this technique was developed to produce a pliable, workable, cementous material that, when hardened, rivaled the compressive strength of stone. Now, one of the most impressive features of this lime mortar is that it allows the building or structure to breathe, expelling moisture that accumulates from within towards the outside. Water infiltration is the most, causes the most major damage and structural failings in architecture, particularly in a subtropical climate like the one we live in. These are images of a beautiful house from the turn of the 20th century on Melpomene Street, whose mortar was improperly repointed with Portland cement. You can see, if you look very carefully, that the moisture is literally pushing the cement mortar out of the wall, which is, in a sense, undermining the structure. And this is where I'd like to point out that the use of lime mortar is not, in fact, primarily historic or restricted to cemeteries. Rather, the lessons we can learn here are part of a practical school of architectural thought. They can help us design building systems that are highly adapted to and respectful of their environments. Today, Portland cement, for example, dominates the building industry, accounting for 8% of the global CO2 emissions. But lime mortar is now being seriously considered in the construction and architectural fields. Lime mortar is carbon neutral because the carbon dioxide emitted during its production is reabsorbed as it chemically converts back toward limestone. Not only that, but the mortar can be removed from the masonry at the end of the building's life when the building dies, and permitting reuse of the materials. We call that salvaging the bricks or the stones when we clean the the lime off, the mortar off. As we continue to learn how to build sustainably and durably, these techniques and these materials are on the cutting edge of architectural discourse. As an industry, we're starting to relearn how to build with sustainable local materials, like these hard-tanned St. Joe's that are still produced in Louisiana for over 120 years, up in the area around Slidell. We're starting to ask ourselves, how can we start to conceive of buildings as dynamic systems rather than hermetically sealed boxes? And as we begin to develop ideas around self-healing concrete, how about we take a closer look at the original self-healing material, lime mortar. That's right, you got it. One which requires neither extraordinary energy expenditure nor biological engineering to be implemented. Pierre Pallon imagines, here, this is where it gets really serious. I should stand, but I can't. Pierre Pallon imagines hands-on programs focusing on such preservation techniques, just like what I was able to offer at the African House. Not only will these young people learn the technical skills necessary to repoint and relay masonry, but they will be thinking through the process of preservation. If we take a look at another of my favorite tools, we can imagine the discourse and questions and arguments to be had, productive arguments. What did this tomb look like when it was whole? We don't know for sure, but we can make an educated guess. If we look at the city records, we can find an approximate date for its construction. Looking at nearby tombs of similar eras, we can reconstruct an approximate design for historic materials, complete with pediments, cornices, and gabled roof. Moving beyond the preservation skills, the empty spots on the cemetery's fabric leave room for new designs. The small scale of tomb projects and the relatively low stakes make them ideal for courses which follow all the steps of an architectural construction project. Groups will begin by surveying the site, looking at adjacent buildings, and speaking with clients before creating potential designs via models and drawings. This will be followed by material and cost estimation, as well as plans for project phasing. This course would be a unique opportunity for young people to participate in and experience the entire construction and design process at an approachable scale. It might be the inspiration for a career in architecture, engineering, or construction, or it might be a valuable framework for a future home renovation. I think that connecting youth with the skills and knowledge to build the world of tomorrow is absolutely critical. And that means valuing craftsmanship and architectural trade work as well as design. As we continue to move through and learn about this cemetery, I want you to be aware of it as a work of 1,000 hands, just as the city which surrounds it is a result of the cumulative effort of thousands. When we think about the people who created New Orleans, we remember a few big names like governors and statesmen and preachers and such. But the wonderful part about this cemetery is the major presence of society tombs created by trade associations. One of the most spectacular is here, the tomb of the German Handwerkers Association. Here we can learn about one of the most fundamental realities of 19th century America, that it was irrevocably shaped by the massive waves of immigrants who brought their languages, values, and skills to this new country. This cemetery is a vivid reminder of this chapter of history, as we see over and over again, the place of birth of these deceased carefully marked out in stone, creating a web of connections, a variety of origins of stories that ended here in New Orleans. This type of map is the result of our recent research efforts. From an analytical view, we can also start to understand this cemetery as a record of major conflicts and events in national history, from the Civil War, Spanish-American Wars to the World Wars. Seeing these resting places in such proximity, there's that word again, brings these parts into tangible reality for the visitor, placing personal individual experience in sharp relief against major geopolitical moments. Now, much of what I've just shown you holds true for the other cemeteries in the city. You can learn about yellow fever at St. Louis No. 2, since many of its wall vaults are still intact. Same goes for masonry, lime mortar, and trade societies at Ballard Street, St. Louis No. 1 or No. 3, or even St. Joseph, the Catholic cemetery, which is right across the street. But these next 2 points are fundamentally different and unique to this place, and are the reason why I believe Lafayette No. 2 is the most worthy of our attention today. I'll now bring you down the street to one of the most significant sites in the cemetery, the French Butchers Society tomb. This tomb is a monument to what some constitutional law scholars consider to be the most destructive decision ever made by the United States Supreme Court, the slaughterhouse cases, which cemented the failure of the radical Reconstruction in the American South and set back this fight for civil rights by at least a century. The French Butcher Society were an association of immigrants employed in the same profession, much like the German hand workers. In 1869, these butchers brought a case against an act recently passed by the Louisiana State Legislature, arguing that it abridged the rights guaranteed to them under the 14th Amendment. While we won't discuss the details of this case today, although I encourage you to go home and read about it, just Google the slaughterhouse cases. Just Google the slaughterhouse and read about it. What's important here is the fact that their argument put the 14th Amendment to the test. This amendment, along with the 13th, was passed at the end of the Civil War to protect the right of African-American population from racially biased state and federal laws. It represented a hopeful new beginning for a reunited country, an era called Reconstruction. In 1873, however, the United States Supreme Court decided against the butchers, gutting the power of the 14th Amendment and ushering in a century of discrimination whose effects are still felt today. It is ironic that a case brought by a primarily white butchers association exploited a constitutional amendment clearly written to protect the rights of recently freed slaves. Some of the primary plaintiffs lie here in a large tomb towards the back of Lafayette No. 2. But let me show you what I find to be the most and deepest irony as it is told in this cemetery. I've shown you the layout of the cemetery several times now. The location of the French butcher's tomb is actually quite strange. You see, this quadrant of the cemetery was the colored section. What surrounds this tomb is a collection of other society tombs, but these are tombs created by African-American benevolent associations. 20 of these tombs still stand in this cemetery, 19 clustered around the butcher's tomb, plus one. I'll talk about that plus one later. These societies were formed around the same time as the slaughterhouse cases, when institutions and social protections for working class whites were spare and non-existent for African-American residents of New Orleans. Without hospitals that would admit African-Americans, these societies were created to provide private health and life insurance to their members. Part of that insurance included a respectful funeral and dignified interment in a society tomb, especially because most of these members could not have afforded a standalone tomb and therefore a sense of memorial. If the slaughterhouse cases decided that the federal government would not be able to ensure the lives and rights of its citizens beyond the minimum These private organizations took matters into their own hands. By the end of the 19th century, more African-American New Orleanians belonged to benevolent societies than to any other association other than churches. These groups not only provided health care, funeral services, and community, but they were also incubators for the musical traditions, which would later make New Orleans famous as the birthplace of jazz. African-American Benevolent Association were also invaluable opportunities for young Black men and women to learn vital transferable skills, such as keeping minutes, managing a budget, and incorporation at a time when there were no opportunities for public education after the 5th grade. For you see, the first African-American high school, public high school rather, in the state of Louisiana was McDonough number 35 that was established in New Orleans in 1917. Where these slaughterhouse cases leave off, where these legal dramas and old white men in suspenders leave us, waiting for the civil rights movement of the 1960s, this cemetery and the society tombs give voice to the men and women who were mentioned, but ultimately left out of the narrative. African Americans during the post-war Reconstruction era were not passive actors. We should remember their names. Celebrated New Orleans poet, playwright, and oral historian Tom Dent notes the lack of writing left to us by formerly enslaved people and their descendants prior to the 20th century. He says, and quote, "Little, if anything, was written by them of them," end quote. While there may be a dearth of written material, we can turn to other means of expression, whether art, song, dance, and the built environment. These tombs are the autobiographies we have been wishing we had. They are the unwritten poetry. I talk a lot about these 19 benevolent association tombs in Lafayette number 2, these 19+1. And the reason for that is because one of the 20, somehow wound up outside of that African-American quadrant and wound up almost near the front gate. And we would really like to find out how that happened. So that's one of our goals. These tombs speak for many, many people who have gone before us and whose resistance, bravery, achievements, and love we may never know. But if we were to be more accurate, these 19+1 tombs are really much more than that. Conservative estimates tell us that there were around 300 African-American benevolent societies in New Orleans at the end of the 1800s, and we know where their tombs went. Girard Street Cemetery is most famous for the supposed saint's curse that came with its demolition. Originally, it contained over 100 African-American benevolent separate organizations. They had their tombs, 100 African-American society tombs before the Girard Street Cemetery was demolished in 1957, when its residents were posthumously segregated, destroying the physical remnants of the networks they had constructed in life. This photograph was taken during the deconsecration of the cemetery and shows several of the hundreds of tombs which no longer exist. So what we see here still standing in LC2 is actually not 19+1. In fact, it is 19+100, 19+1,000 voices and spirits together, creating something more than themselves. Okay, that's why I want us to look at this cemetery holistically, not just as a collection of needy and fragile structures, but as a collection of irreplaceable adjacencies. That's a really important word. telling history much more fully than any textbook. What does it mean to have these tombs in such proximity to each other and to the French butcher's tomb? They begin to fill in the blanks of a story which would otherwise be of hopeless injustice. Rather, these tombs speak not only of injustice, but of a people of enormous resilience, resourcefulness, and courage. These tombs are locked in a debate, a call and collective response in the name of equality. Lafayette is more than a sum of its parts. Its value comes in the collection of historic structures in proximity to one another and in their location in the breast of an historically significant neighborhood in one of the most significant cities in the United States of America. And its value also comes in the living connection it still harbors. These tombs are connected to the communities which built them. The Young Men Olympians are proof of that. Founded in 1884, only a decade after the slaughterhouse case, but continuing to parade, care for, and use their tombs just as they continue to foster community within Central City and beyond. As we discuss our future, the kind of a future we are building together, and this future we dream of for our children, we talk a lot about the symbols we surround ourselves with. We talk about monuments, whether that be monuments we would like taken down or monuments we would like erected. But I'd like to reframe that for you. What if we talked about monuments that we preserve? Nowhere in the country are we so aware of our Osmandian mortality. This weather, this climate will bring it all to dust in time. With what we decide to maintain and preserve, we decide what's worth remembering. So I argue that we keep these monuments because they are monuments. More than that, they are monuments which were built by the very people they commemorate. And they are living monuments, functional physical systems which exist in a particular community, something that we might call architecture. These tombs may be some of the earliest examples of African-American monumental architecture. That is, architecture built for Black people by Black people. What our project aims to do is to help preserve these structures by encouraging the connections they already have to the communities within, which surround them. In the remaining time, I'd like to show you the plans we have to facilitate this exchange between brick and mortar and the open minds of our young people. We intend to generate the funds and labor necessary to restore the physical assets of the cemetery, all of the structures in the cemetery, not limited to the African American, all of them in the cemetery, by promoting the educational experience latent in the site. The educational experience would attract both kids and adults by offering ethical learning opportunities within this precious resource, whereas most tours recycle the same stories orally transmitted and dubiously sourced. The Pierre Pallon Project has already begun to curate a selection of rigorously researched materials supplemented by archival images, digital maps, and architectural drawings. We are committed to collecting, preserving, and sharing both archival and communally held memories about this site and neighborhood, which would otherwise slip away forgotten. This photo was taken in the colored section of the cemetery in 1940s. It was a poignant sadness that it holds. Neither the wooden headboard, the iron fence, nor the garbage incinerator, oh Lord, or the garbage incinerator behind it exist anymore, except in memory. Neither do the two people memorialized on the headstone. But because of this photograph, they are remembered, ensured existence as long as the archive exists. Like Clarence John Laughlin, we want to preserve these fragile and ephemeral memories for the future and for our future generations. Our primary strategy is an inside-out approach. That is, The first and primary audience of the content we create should always be those who live nearby and who have direct connection to the site. That's why we're so excited to have such wonderful local organizations as our initial partners as the Young Men Olympians, the Youth Empowerment Project, and the Small Center, as well as the Tulane Center for the Gulf South. We have already led several tours through the Lafayette Cemetery #2 and are currently working to put together lesson plans that will be piloted with the Youth Empowerment Program. By the way, there is an example of a lesson plan that was pieced together by a young man who was a mathematics teacher and finished with a degree in mathematics, which is on display here in the room. It's a very interesting piece, very interesting take on what he saw in the cemetery. If you take a look at it at the end of the lecture. So we've done these tours. All right. As I've mentioned, I want to frame the physical restoration process again. I'm going to say it again, as an educational experience in itself. That's very important for me to emphasize, because that's what we plan on doing. Every aspect of the construction will be narrated by a trained, one of our trained charges, for people who come, young people who come to work with us, will be trained to narrate what is happening at a site where construction work is in progress when students are visiting the site. We're not going to stop work when they come in. They're going to get a lesson right there on the site. Pierre Perlon is imagining having groups of young folks alongside us, learning practical skills, discipline, and the history at the same time, just as I once did with my father and he did with his. This is a wagon wheel wall built by my father at our family home in Holly Grove, not far from here. The only one I know of in existence, which still stands today as his built legacy. I'm going to end this presentation with a recitation of some words that I really wish were my own, but they're not, but they've become part of me because they express exactly what I feel both about the preservation process and the craft that I have adopted as my own. The title of it is The Craftsman by Dr. Marcus Christian. Oh boy, I hope this leg works. I ply with all the cunning of my art this little thing, and with consummate care I fashion it, so that when I depart, those who come after me shall find it fair and beautiful. It must be free of flaws, pointing no laborings of weary hands, and there must be no flouting of the laws of beauty as the artist understands. Through passion, yearnings infinite yet dumb, I lift you from the depths of my own mind and gild you with my soul's white heat to plumb the souls of future men. I leave behind this thing that in return this solace gives. He who creates true beauty ever lives. Thank you.
Patty, I'd like to say that your presentation today exactly illustrates the goal that we have for the Martha Gilmore Robinson Lecture, which is not to tell the history of a building, but to ask questions and probe the philosophy of what we do and why we do it. Thank you so much for a beautiful presentation.
Questions?
Yes, Mr. Pierre, we have a couple questions from the Q&A, and we can open up to questions in the audience as long as you repeat them on the mic before you answer them. But Karen Snyder is asking, could Mr. Pierre look at the exposed bricks in an upper P2 house wall and tell what kind of bricks, low fired ? And what kind of mortar? We assume the bricks were from a brickyard in the neighborhood back in 1799 when P2 House was first constructed.
Oh. Uh-huh. You want me to go outside and do that?
Maybe we'll save that for the end. You know,
Yes.
or we
That's a
can,
great adventure. Yes. Uh-huh. I will do that. Yes, I'm take on that challenge. Yes, indeed.
Cool. So we can open up to Q&A, both from the live streamers, the attendees. If you want to write it in the Q&A panel, I'll read it. And to our people in the audience, if Mr. Pierre repeats their question before answering.
Yes.
Is lime mortar now the preferred material to use?
In restoration projects, especially when we are working with the, I'm sorry, the question was, is lime mortar the preferred mortar to use in restoration projects currently? Yes. And the way that works is the brick or the stone that you're using, the qualities of that material determine the recipe for the mortar. The mortar that I typically use is a hydraulic lime-based mortar. And it is, the recipe is typically 2 parts sand to 1 part hydraulic lime. It is yes, that is the preferred. In fact, the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training has said that there should be no Portland cement, none, zero, not even very small portions of Portland cement mortar used in conjunction with low-fired brick or a really soft stone material. Yes.
How about in current?
Oh, if you're using hard-fired brick, man, you can use Mr. Aspden's mortar all day long. Joseph, that's the guy who did Portland cement. Yeah, you can use Portland cement all day long. It really doesn't matter. No. Yes.
So as far as your physical restoration and your hands-on teaching lessons, how do you go about deciding which tombs that you're going to start working on first? And how do you go about getting permission either from the owners or from the city to work on those tombs?
You know, I really wish somebody would, a young lady to my right would stand up and answer that question. Because we would be making a beeline to her very soon. This young lady is the superintendent of cemeteries, Emily Ford. Y'all should give her a round of applause. And so, no, what we've done is we know our priority tomb right now is young men Olympians because they own their tombs. There's no question about that. The other ones, even though they're so-called abandoned, according to what Emily has told us, there is a procedure that has to go through in order to get clearance for us to even touch those two. So we've got a hellacious journey ahead of us. We're willing to take on the challenge, but it's going to take some effort to make that move, to move that mountain, and it's going to be a big fat mountain to move. But we're willing to do it. They may come one by one. I wish we could line them up and work and run 10 to 12 tombs at a time to restore them, to get them in shape. But that's not going to happen. It really won't happen. Thank you.
Is LC2 open to the public?
The cemetery is open to the public, yes.
Anybody going anytime?
Well, there are hours. It's what's the hours?
The hours are 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. on Saturday, and it's closed on Sunday.
So, but I mean, if you get in there, and you know what's really interesting, if you're in there right toward the end of the day, the city employees drive in and they blow their horn so you don't get locked in. Guess who got locked in one day? And I had to call her Emily, and she came and got me out because I'm too old to be trying to climb that fence. Yes, ma'am. occasionally.
We
Right.
had a service there last month. Probably about every other month in that cemetery.
Yeah.
There are many, many active families in that cemetery. I met a person whose younger brother was buried in the butcher's tomb on Friday.
On Friday?
I've been doing this for 10 years. I am still surprised by how many families come back, even for material for lots that I would have for sure said nobody was coming back for. There are always people coming back.
So we'd like to take one more question.
Yes. Oh, that's the author of the poem. That's Marcus Christian, Dr. Marcus Christian. Yes, sir. He was the director of the Negro writers during the WPA. That's him.
And his papers at UNO.
Yes, that's correct. He was, in fact, he never got a college degree, but he wound up on the faculty at UNO. Yeah, highly regarded as well.
Teddy, we want to thank you.
Yes, you're
so much for
welcome.
joining us.
You have a couple questions in the Q&A. Is
Thank
it
you.
possible?
Ladies and gentlemen, the Louisiana Landmark Society would like to invite you into the next room for refreshments. And I do warn you that the punch is a little strong. So if you're not inclined, you might ask for water. Thank you for coming.
Did you tell me if I wasn't? Come on. All right.